Just after midnight on March 9th, 1947, a man slipped out the front door of his four-story brownstone mansion on New York City's iconic Fifth Avenue. The man was named Langley Collier. He was 61 years old, and he was a trained engineer. He was a very famous concert pianist, and he was very wealthy. But he didn't dress like he was wealthy. This night, Langley was going for an 8-mile walk to the south to Brooklyn, New York, where he was going to pick up a very specific thing that he needed for his older brother Homer, who was currently laid up in bed on the second floor of the mansion. It was a freezing cold night, and so as Langley walked along the road, he flipped up his collar of his very shabby wool coat that was held together by safety pins. Nowadays, Langley felt like the only time he was safe going outside was at night, because at nighttime he could kind of hide from the prying eyes of his neighbors or police officers or really anyone. It was the one time he could basically be invisible. And so Langley scurried his way down the dimly lit sidewalk, looking left and right constantly to make sure he wasn't being followed. And then finally at 2 a.m., he arrived at his destination in Brooklyn, a very particular set of dumpsters. And right away, Langley got to work. He went in that dumpster and he got the things he was looking for and then put them in his bag, slung it over his shoulder, and then began the long, slow walk back home. Several weeks later, on March 21st, the phone rang inside the police station near where the Collier brothers lived. And so a sergeant picked up the phone, and on the other line was a guy who called himself Charles Smith, and in a very gruff voice, he told the sergeant that there was a dead body in the Collier brothers' mansion. Now, while of course this was a huge tip, the sergeant was skeptical because the police were aware of the fact that there were lots of rumors floating around about the Collier brothers. They were very eccentric. I mean, Langley's going out at night with a bag over his shoulder and going to look at dumpsters in Brooklyn. I mean, they were also kind of reclusive, and the windows outside of their mansion were boarded up with wood and metal. And so people were kind of on edge about the Collier brothers, and periodically, when they heard rumors about them, they would call the police and report it. And so the police were used to getting these rumor calls, going and checking it out, only to discover that they were not true. And so this sergeant said to Charles Smith, well, how do you know there's a dead body inside the mansion? But the caller simply didn't answer and hung up. And so because the sergeant did not necessarily believe this was a credible tip, instead of sending an entire investigative team to the mansion to check out this dead body, he asked a single police officer to, when he had time, make his way over and basically do a wellness check on the Collier brothers. And so later that day, this one lone police officer showed up to the Collier brothers' mansion. He got out of his cruiser and he just stopped and looked at the brownstone mansion. Even though it was every bit a mansion, it was not in good condition. All the windows were boarded up with wood and metal, and the glass behind them was all shattered. There was newspapers coming out of the broken windows like they had been jammed up against the inside of the windows. There was all this furniture and wooden crates and just junk piled up outside the front of the property. I mean, the place looked kind of dilapidated, and he was shocked that anybody lived in here to begin with. But the Collier family were not normal people. Langley and Homer's dad was a doctor, and he would take home pieces of real people, like parts and organs and that kind of thing, and he would put them in glass jars and put them on display all over the house. Their dad also always canoed to work, which meant walking out of the mansion with a canoe on his shoulder, walking to East River, canoeing his way in his fancy doctor clothes all the way until he got off, and then carrying the canoe to his office building. As for Langley and Homer's mother, she was the first cousin of their dad, and she also kicked their dad out of the house when he tried to convert their entire house into a sanatorium, which is kind of like a cross between a hospital and a resort for people who are recovering from tuberculosis. And so the brothers had grown up in this very odd family, and while they were totally brilliant, they were also very eccentric. Homer, the older brother, was a literal genius who was accepted to study law at the highly prestigious Ivy League University, Columbia, at the age of 14. Langley, who was 5 years younger than Homer, also graduated from Columbia, where he got 2 degrees, one in engineering and one in chemistry. But Langley wasn't just an accomplished scientist, he was also this incredible musician. In fact, he was such a talented pianist that he actually performed shows at New York's legendary Carnegie Hall. But despite their incredible achievements and their huge wealth, Homer and Langley never got married. And over time, after the death of their parents, Homer and Langley became more and more reclusive inside of this mansion. And then in 1933, so 14 years before this lone police officer had arrived at the Collier brothers' mansion to investigate a dead body, Homer Collier had had a stroke and went completely blind. He was only 55 at the time, and really he was at the height of his career, but he was forced to quit his law practice. As for Langley, even though he was very successfully selling pianos and playing these incredible shows at Carnegie Hall, he too had to give up what he was doing and stay home and take care of his brother. And once this happened, the two brothers basically stayed in the mansion all the time. They basically never left. And they also stopped paying any of their bills, so their water, their phone, their electricity all got cut off. But instead of the brothers paying the bills to get the power back, Langley just went out and bought a Model T car, and he pulled the engine out of the car and built his own generator. And then when they stopped paying their mortgage, eventually the police came to the mansion to evict them. And when Langley came to the door to speak to the officer, he just wrote a check for the entire amount of the mansion, basically paying for it on the spot. He handed the check to the police officer and then told the officer to leave them alone. And so fast forward back to March 21st, 1947, and this lone police officer, after staring up at this dilapidated mansion, finally walked forward and climbed over all the furniture and junk that was all out front, and he literally climbed his way up the front steps to the front door, where he began pounding on it. But after a while, no one came to the door, and the officer couldn't hear anything inside. Now, because this officer was here to investigate a dead body, no matter how uncredible the claim, the officer knew he really needed to get inside and have a look around. And so he decided he would try to break in the front door. And so after knocking a few more times just to make sure really no one was there, the officer called out and said, "I'm coming in," and then began pounding with his shoulder against the door. And pretty quickly the door gave way, but it only opened a few inches. And so the officer tried to fit through it, but he was too big, he couldn't fit. But he was able to look into the crack, and he saw there was this huge man-made wall that was basically positioned right inside of the mansion, blocking the front door from opening more than a couple of inches. And so as the officer was thinking about why there would be this wall here, he began to smell this terrible smell coming out of the mansion. And at that point, the officer thought, okay, there could be a dead body in here. I don't know what's going on. And so he called for backup. When backup arrived, the group of officers attempted to smash the front door in together. All 7 of them are ramming against this door, but they could not break down the man-made wall inside. And so ultimately, the police got a ladder and they lined it up on the side of the property, and one of the officers was able to climb up to the 2nd floor, break a window, and climb in that way. And once the police all made their way into the 2nd floor of this mansion, they realized very quickly that the tip Charles Smith had given had been correct. There was a dead body inside of this mansion. It was Homer Collier, the older brother. He was seated in a chair in this alcove on the 2nd floor. He only had on this ragged bathrobe, and he was kind of slouched forward with his head resting on his knee with all these orange peels all around him. The coroner would ultimately determine that Homer likely had been dead for about 10 hours. As for Langley Collier, despite looking around the mansion for him, they couldn't find him. It was like he had just vanished into thin air. And so pretty quickly, the police became suspicious of Langley because they couldn't find him, and they began to think, maybe he had something to do with his brother's death, and that's why he's not here now. In fact, maybe it was Langley who called in the tip as Charles Smith out on the road somewhere after he'd run away. So the police posted an officer at the Collier brothers' mansion. Basically, his job was to stay there in case Langley came back at any time. He could be detained. And then also the police put out a 9-state alarm. Basically, all the states around New York were told to keep an eye out for Langley because he was wanted for questioning in connection to his brother's death. And so as police agencies all across the East Coast searched for Langley, largely in vain, detectives in New York continued to search the Collier brothers' mansion to find clues that might shed some light about where Langley went and what role he might have played in Homer's death. And on April 8th, 1947, so 18 days after Homer was first discovered, the police would finally find that big clue that would break the case wide open. Back on March 21st, when that lone police officer first responded to the Collier brothers' house because of this call about the dead body, and then the officer broke the door in and discovered that man-made wall right behind the door, well, that man-made wall was not constructed out of normal building materials like brick or wood or anything else you might expect a wall to be built out of. Instead, it was built out of things like chairs and beds and a sewing machine and all sorts of just junk. It was trash. And this trash wall started right in front of the inside of the front door, and it extended back towards the interior living space of that floor. Except there really wasn't any living space at all anywhere inside of this mansion. Not the second floor, first, third, fourth, nowhere. Because every surface inside of this mansion was covered wall to wall, floor to ceiling, in trash. Things like 14 broken pianos, an x-ray machine, there was a horse's jawbone, there were 25,000 books, and of course they had all of their father's glass jars that contained all of these human body parts. And over the years, the Collier brothers had apparently begun to think that their neighbors and random passerbys out on the street would someday break into their mansion and steal these treasures from their home. For reference, the Collier brothers did have real treasure in their house. They had tons of cash, they had jewelry, they had real valuables. But to them, that wasn't the real treasure. The real treasure were the things they pulled out of the dumpsters all around the city. And so that was the stuff they were worried about getting stolen from random people outside. And so they had begun fortifying the inside of this mansion to protect themselves when inevitably these people began breaking in. And so basically the inside of their mansion had not just been turned into a big trash pile, but instead they had created all these sophisticated tunnels through all the trash that was everywhere, and lining these tunnels and all these special alleyways they had built were real booby traps. And it was when the police were inspecting one of these tunnels with booby traps in it that they discovered the big clue that broke the case wide open. Based on that big clue, here is the leading theory about what happened to Homer and Langley Collier. Back on March 9th, 1947, so the night that Langley had snuck out the front door in the middle of the night with his shabby clothes on and headed to Brooklyn, where he went dumpster diving, well, he wasn't just dumpster diving to find new treasures to bring back to the mansion to stuff inside. Instead, he was actually looking for something really specific for his brother. He was looking for oranges, like the fruit. And this particular dumpster in Brooklyn was right behind a store that sold fruit, and so there were always lots of oranges in this dumpster. Langley was actually trying his very best to take care of his older brother Homer. He had actually begun doing research using his father's old medical textbooks to try to find a cure for Homer's blindness caused by his stroke. And at some point, Langley believed he really had come across the cure. And the cure was basically for Homer to eat oranges. Lots and lots of oranges. And in fact, over the last several weeks before this night, Langley had already made this change in Homer's diet. He only fed him oranges for every single meal. He got them from this dumpster and he fed them to Homer. And Homer, he too believed this cure was going to work, and so he ate the oranges without question. And so back on March 9th, after Langley had gathered up the oranges from inside this dumpster, slung it on his shoulder, and walked back to his mansion, he maneuvered his way through the crack in the front door because he was super skinny. He was able to barely get through. And then once he was inside the mansion and shut the door behind him, he maneuvered his way up to the second floor. And then he began the most dangerous part of his journey from one side of the second floor to the other where Homer was. Basically, Langley needed to crawl through a 2-foot wide tunnel he had built through all the junk and trash, but it was lined with booby traps. In particular, there was a nasty trap at the end of the tunnel where there was this stack of metal boxes filled with all these newspapers. They were really heavy, and they were positioned so if you even so much as barely touched the lowest box, they would come crashing down on you. Now, Langley had made this journey countless times. This is how he went to see his brother every single day, as he went through this tunnel. But on this day, as he low-crawled his way through the tight tunnel in the trash, he accidentally knocked the lowest metal box. The boxes tumbled down on him and pinned him to the ground. Now, these boxes were very heavy, but they were not heavy enough to kill someone. It would just pin them down. It would be impossible to get out from under them. And so Langley, very likely, after getting trapped, called out for his brother, Homer, who was actually only 10 feet away from him. But Homer was blind, he was sick, he had absolutely no energy because all he ate was oranges and it was basically killing him. And so he couldn't even get out of his chair, let alone go save his brother. And so for several agonizing hours, Langley likely yelled for his brother until the weight of all these boxes did crush him to death. And then Homer was left all alone in this house where no one knew he needed help and no one could even get to him if they wanted to. And so he was doomed. And so for 2 weeks, Homer just sat in this chair, starving to death, while he likely listened to the sound of rats eating his brother's body. The big clue that the police found that broke this case wide open is they actually spotted Langley's white foot bone that had been picked clean by the rats jutting up out of this trash tunnel 10 feet away from Homer. When the police had first searched the mansion, it was so full of stuff that they never saw this bone. It just kind of blended in. But 18 days after finding Homer, they realized Langley was right there. There was a skeleton. As for the Charles Smith tipster that police thought had to be Langley calling in after he had murdered his brother, well, it wasn't Langley because Langley was dead at the time this tip came in. And so Charles Smith was a real person who very likely just walked past the mansion and he probably caught a whiff of the smell of rotting dead bodies, and so he called it in. 4 months after Homer and Langley were found dead inside of their maze of trash, their mansion was declared a fire hazard and demolished. Today, there is a small park called the Collier Brothers Park, and it's filled with nothing but a couple of trees and a bench. On the morning of Sunday, April 26, 2009, in a suburb of Atlanta, Georgia, a 25-year-old woman named Heather Strube sat with her boyfriend, Mike, at the kitchen table of Mike's home. Heather and Mike had been dating for a year, but somehow everything still felt fresh and new, and Heather wished she could just spend all day with Mike. But this Sunday, Heather had plans. She was going to church, then to do some chores at her house, and then she would pick up her 19-month-old son from his father. She knew, in theory, she could skip church in order to spend a little more time with Mike. But for Heather, skipping church was like missing a meal. Whenever she did it, she ended up with an empty feeling in her stomach. So, after taking her last bite, Heather stood up and dropped her dishes in the sink, kissed Mike on the forehead, told him she loved him, and walked out the door. Heather drove across town to church, went inside, sat down in a long wooden pew, and waited for the service to start. Church had always been an important part of Heather's life. In fact, she was convinced that if it wasn't for church, she never would have been born, because Heather's parents had first met and fallen in love at a Presbyterian church camp. That was why, when Heather was a teenager, it had felt like fate when she went to youth group and fell in love with a young classmate named Stephen Strube. Heather and Stephen had connected right away. They dated for several years and always talked about their future together. And then in May of 2004, they got married. At first, life had been good for the young couple. Heather and her parents opened a flower shop, and Heather worked there every day. She had always loved flowers, and being around them just made her happy. And the flower shop was a true family business. Stephen would often come by to help out at the shop, and his mother, Joanna, she would even pitch in when things got really busy. And in September of 2007, the family grew when Heather and Stephen had a baby boy. They named him Carson, and Heather felt like God had truly blessed her and her family. But now, sitting in church, Heather did not feel so blessed anymore. She was vaguely aware that the preacher had started the service, but she was barely listening. She was only thinking about Carson. Heather had not seen her son all weekend, and she hated the days when she wasn't with him. And she blamed her now soon-to-be ex-husband, Stephen, for keeping them apart. Heather and Stephen's happy life had fallen apart just months after Carson was born. One day at the flower shop, Stephen's mom, Joanna, had come across a receipt for some jewelry that Stephen had bought. Joanna figured the jewelry had been a gift for Heather, and she thought Heather might want the receipt to keep track of the family finances. But when Heather looked at the receipt, she'd been really confused. She didn't recognize the jewelry that was listed on the receipt. Stephen had never given her anything like that. And that's when she realized Stephen must be cheating on her, and he had bought this jewelry for some other woman. And when she confronted him about it, Stephen admitted to everything. Heather had at least wanted to try to make the marriage work, but Stephen told her he had a new girlfriend and he wanted a divorce. Now, in church, Heather realized the preacher was finishing up his sermon, and she saw everyone standing up around her. She felt bad for not having paid much attention, so she stood up and smiled and spent an extra few minutes talking to other members of the congregation. And after the service was over, as Heather walked to her car, she told herself not to dwell on all the negative things in her life. Even though her marriage had fallen apart, God still provided for her. She had a great new boyfriend, she was part of a church filled with people who loved and cared about her, and she had a beautiful little boy. At around 6 p.m. that night, Heather drove across town to pick up Carson. But the little bit of hope she had started to feel after church had now disappeared, and she felt uneasy. She always felt like this when seeing Stephen, because their custody swap meetings had been tense from the beginning. Nearly every single time Heather and Stephen met to hand off Carson, they would get into an argument. The baby lived with Heather, and Stephen had him every other weekend, but Stephen had been arguing for joint custody because he wanted Carson to live with him half the time. The fights between the parents had gotten so bad at one point that Heather had insisted on doing the custody swaps in the parking lot of a busy shopping center. Recently, though, the animosity had sort of leveled off. Stephen just wanted to be done with the divorce proceedings, so he had finally agreed to allow Heather full custody of their son. Still, though, Heather preferred to meet Stephen in public. When Heather pulled into the Target parking lot in the city of Snellville, Georgia that night, she saw Stephen was already there, waiting outside of his car. So Heather parked and then walked over to him. Stephen said a quick hello, and he lifted Carson out of his car and handed him over to Heather. And without saying anything else, Stephen got back in his car and drove out of the lot. But Heather was so happy to have her son back, she didn't even care that Stephen had barely acknowledged her. She had a huge smile on her face and talked to Carson as she carried him to her SUV. She opened the rear passenger door and carefully secured him in his car seat. Heather shut the door and walked around to the driver's side, and she heard footsteps coming up behind her. Heather turned around, and she was startled to see a strange-looking man standing there. He had wild hair and a thick mustache, and he had a messenger bag strapped around his shoulder. This man spoke to Heather, and when she heard what he said, she lunged for the door and tried to open it. Seconds later, shoppers in this busy Target parking lot heard the loud bang of a gunshot. Some of the shoppers just froze in complete terror, and others took off running and screaming, afraid the shooter would keep on firing. But a couple of the shoppers immediately turned in the direction of the sound, and they saw a man with wild hair calmly walking away from an SUV towards the woods that surrounded the shopping center. These shoppers rushed over to the SUV, and when they saw a woman slumped on the ground and blood covering her face, they called 911. Officer Neil Carter of the Snellville Police was patrolling in his cruiser not far from the target when he heard the call come through on the police radio. Carter instantly spun a U-turn and stepped on the gas. When he pulled into the Target parking lot, he saw a group of people already heading towards his car. Carter parked, stepped outside, and then walked directly into complete chaos. Everybody in the parking lot, all these people who had just been doing some Sunday shopping before they witnessed a shooting, descended on Officer Carter. And they were shouting and trying to tell him what they saw, but there were so many of them, and they were all so upset that Carter couldn't understand anything they were telling him. Carter held up his hands and told them to please step back. He needed everyone to calm down. But a few people in the crowd just kept on shouting. Clearly, they had something truly urgent, and they pointed Carter towards a parked SUV. Carter looked over and saw a woman's body lying on the ground by that SUV. He ran to her, but even from a few feet away, he could see the woman had been shot. Carter reached down to feel the woman's pulse, but he already knew she was dead. When Carter stood back up, he saw a woman from the crowd coming towards him, shouting. But this time, Carter understood exactly what he was hearing. This woman was shouting, "There's a baby in the back seat." Carter felt his heartbeat spike. He turned around and peered through the window, bracing himself for the sight of an injured child. Instead, to his relief, he saw a little boy, maybe a year and a half old, staring back at him with wide eyes. The little boy looked scared, but he was unharmed. Carter opened the door of the SUV, lifted up the boy, still in the car seat, and carried him to his police cruiser, setting him down in the back. At this point, Carter saw a wave of police and first responders arriving, and he saw the crowd rushing towards them like they did to him. Carter just looked at the baby in the back of his police car. Carter could barely think straight, and he wasn't sure what to do next. But at least this little boy was safe. Just then, Carter heard shouting behind him again, and he turned and saw another woman approaching him, waving her arms to get his attention. His first impulse was to tell her to stay back, but she pointed to a spot near the edge of the parking lot, and she said she had seen the shooter standing there before the shooting. This could be a solid lead, so Carter quickly refocused and started writing down the woman's account in his notebook. She said the shooter had been watching the victim from nearby, on the other side of a few parked cars. He was a short, slender man with an odd mustache and wild black hair, and he was wearing khaki pants and a blue button-up shirt. Carter thanked the woman and then shared her description of the shooter to the other officers at the scene. Carter stayed behind and arranged for the baby to be taken to the police station, while other officers fanned out and began searching the area around the target with canine units, hoping to find the suspect. The police dogs led their handlers to the edge of the parking lot and then followed a scent through the woods surrounding the target into the parking lot of an adjacent hotel. But that's where the dogs lost the trail. The police figured the killer must have gotten into a vehicle parked at that location and driven off. Just beyond the hotel parking lot was a highway, and the officers knew that by now, the killer was probably miles away. Meanwhile, back at the crime scene, Officer Carter found the victim's purse with her license inside of it. Now they had an ID. Her name was Heather Strube. Soon after Officer Carter identified Heather, Lieutenant Trey Downs of the Snellville Police Department arrived at the target parking lot. The place was still pretty chaotic, with police officers, witnesses, first responders, and police dogs spread out everywhere, but Lieutenant Downs looked completely unfazed by any of it. He quickly met with Officer Carter to get an update and also a description of the shooter. Then he walked right towards the target. As he got closer, he saw several security cameras mounted on the roof of the store pointing down at the parking lot, and he smiled. Downs had already figured that this store would have decent security, and now he believed these specific cameras would be the key to finding the shooter. Inside the store, Downs flagged down an employee and told her that he needed to see the security footage for the entire day. The employee led him through the store to a cramped room filled with multiple security screens. A man was already hunched over the screens, watching the scene currently unfolding in the parking lot. That man introduced himself to Downs as the director of security. Downs told him that he needed to see everything the cameras had picked up that evening, so the security director pulled up the footage. At first, as Downs examined each camera angle, he was disappointed. There were no cameras aimed directly at where Heather had parked, and so there was no footage of the actual shooting. But as he looked closely at the footage that they did have, Downs spotted a man who perfectly matched the description of the shooter. The man entered the parking lot on foot, walked in the direction of Heather's SUV, and a short time after, walked away toward the surrounding woods. The footage was low resolution. Downs asked if he could have the footage so he could send it off to the crime lab for possible enhancement. But the security director surprised him by saying that Target actually had its own forensics lab that was so good, Target had actually closed cases that even the FBI couldn't solve. The security director promised he'd get the footage out first thing in the morning and get the process started. Downs said that would be a huge help, and he headed out of the store. The sun was setting, and the parking lot looked calm and empty compared to how it had been when Downs first arrived. He saw crime scene investigators packing up their equipment for the night. One of them had called him over to tell him that Heather had been shot with a .38 caliber revolver, but the weapon itself had not been found at the scene, and neither had any clear fingerprints. This was not the news Downs was hoping for. So far, he had a good physical description of the suspect and some blurry video, but not much else. But he figured he did have at least one other thing to go on. This shooting did not appear to be a random attack. Downs believed Heather had been targeted. Heather's parents were out of town, driving through Alabama, when Heather's mom's cell phone began to ring. She picked it up and heard the voice of her father, Heather's grandfather, on the other end, and his voice was shaking. He told her that he had just been visited by the police and he had some horrible news that he could barely even believe was true. The police had brought Carson to his house and told him that Heather had been murdered. Heather's mom screamed and hung up the phone. Heather's dad, who was driving, asked her what was going on. Heather's mom could barely get the words out, but she told him that their daughter had been killed. Heather's dad pulled over to the side of the road, and the two parents just sat there and wept. Then they turned the car around and began making the trip back home to Georgia. Several hours later, late on the night of the murder, Heather's parents walked into the Snellville police station and saw Lieutenant Downs waiting for them. Heather's parents looked completely dazed, like they barely knew where they were. They'd sped home from Alabama, almost without saying a word to each other. It was almost like if they didn't talk about what had happened, maybe it wasn't real. But earlier, they had gone right to Heather's grandfather's house, and when they saw him sitting with Heather's little boy in his lap, it had hit them. They had lost their daughter, and Carson had lost his mom. At the station, Lieutenant Downs said he was deeply sorry for their loss. He understood they were grieving and in shock, but every second counted in a homicide investigation, and so he couldn't wait to ask them questions. Heather's parents said they understood, and they followed Downs to his office and sat across from him at his desk. First, Downs wanted to know if they knew what their daughter was doing at the Target that evening. Was she just shopping? Heather's mom shook her head. She said Heather and her husband Stephen were separated, and they met at Target to hand off their son as part of their custody agreement. The custody battle had been ugly, she said. She paused, and in a quiet voice, she asked Lieutenant Downs if he thought Stephen could have had something to do with Heather's death. Downs was not surprised by this question. A husband going through a divorce was almost always suspect number one in a murder like this. It was his first thought too. But as an investigator, he liked to keep his evidence and theories under wraps as much as possible. But he did tell Heather's mom that they had a good description of the shooter and it didn't match Stephen. And beyond that, Stephen had been seen driving away from the parking lot at the exact time the killer approached. So no, he said, he did not think Stephen was the shooter. What Downs didn't say was that he had not ruled out the possibility that Stephen had hired someone else to kill his estranged wife. Downs told Heather's parents he just needed one more thing: a list of all the people who knew that Heather would be in that parking lot at that time of day for the custody swap. And after thinking for a few minutes, Heather's parents came up with about a dozen people, and Downs wrote down all the names. Downs told them again how sorry he was, and then he walked them out of the police station. Downs went back to his office and read over the list Heather's parents had just given him, and he decided there was no way around it. The only person it made sense to start with was Heather's estranged husband, Stephen Strube. The next morning, Lieutenant Downs and another officer arrived at a house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. This was Stephen's mom's house, and Downs discovered Stephen had started staying here after he and Heather had split up. Downs had barely slept, but nobody would ever know. He looked sharp and full of energy. He knocked on the door, and a young man answered it. Downs asked him if he was Stephen Strube, but the young man just said no, turned around, and walked away. Downs looked at the other officer, a little confused by what had just happened. Downs was about to shout at the young man to come back and talk to them when a middle-aged man walked up to the door and asked if he could help. So Downs asked him if Stephen was home, and the man laughed. He said, yes, Stephen was home. He was the one who just answered the door. Lieutenant Downs glanced over at the other officer again, and they both looked like they might start laughing. Stephen lying to their face and then just walking off was really strange. The middle-aged man invited Downs and the other officer inside the home and led them to the front room, where Stephen was now sitting on the couch. Downs immediately asked Stephen why he just pretended to be somebody else. And without missing a beat, Stephen said he was on probation for burglary and he'd violated his probation. So now he was just trying to dodge the cops. Downs told him that was not very smart, but he said they were here about something far more serious than Stephen breaking his probation. They were here because Stephen's wife had been murdered in the Target parking lot right after she had met up with him. Stephen got off the couch, and his attitude completely changed. He looked terrified, and he asked where his son was. Was Carson okay? Downs assured him Carson was safe and that he had not been hurt. Police had already taken him to stay with Heather's grandfather for the time being. Stephen collapsed on the couch and tried to catch his breath. Downs gave him a few minutes to collect himself and then asked him about his relationship with Heather. Stephen struggled to focus, but he admitted he had not been a great husband. He had cheated on Heather, and he'd given her a really hard time about child custody during most of the divorce process. But he said he'd finally cut all of that out and had agreed to let Heather have full custody of Carson. And he said no matter how badly they might have fought about stuff, he never would have hurt Heather. Downs said they could wrap things up, at least for now. He just needed to know where Stephen went after meeting Heather at that Target. Stephen said he met up with his girlfriend and then they got his car washed. After that, he came home to his mom's house and just hung out by himself because his mom was away visiting her parents. Downs could check with the girlfriend about the car wash, but Stephen had no real alibi for where he went after that. Still, Downs knew pinning down exactly where Stephen had been wouldn't necessarily help the investigation, because unless Stephen had the ability to be two places at once, he was not the one who pulled the trigger. So Downs told Stephen they'd follow up if they needed to, and then he and the other officer left the house and went back to the station. Sitting in his office, Downs felt conflicted. He thought Stephen could have paid someone to kill Heather because of the divorce, and in addition to that, Downs now knew Stephen had violated probation for another crime. But Downs had also seen how upset Stephen got when he thought something might have happened to his son, and Downs just felt like he couldn't be faking that. So, Downs began going back over the list of people Heather's parents had given him, and something hit him right away. And he admitted to himself it seemed pretty obvious. If Heather's husband didn't kill her, maybe her boyfriend did. Later that day, an officer led Heather's boyfriend, Mike Vickers, into an interview room at the station, where Lieutenant Downs was waiting. And right away, Downs noticed Mike's slight size. He was about 5 foot 7 inches tall, and he was slender, just like the suspect on the Target surveillance video. Mike sat across from Downs in the small, bright room, and Downs casually asked him what he had done the past weekend, almost like this was a conversation between two friends just catching up. Mike said on Saturday night, he and Heather had gone to his parents' house for game night. It was something they did on a lot of weekends. And on Sunday morning, they ate breakfast together before Heather headed out to church, and he went into work. Following up with Mike's employer to check if he'd really been there would be easy enough, so Downs shifted his focus. He asked Mike about the custody swaps between Heather and Stephen. Did he know how they worked? Did Heather say anything about the custody swap this past Sunday? Mike said he had actually gone to one of these custody swaps in the past, so he knew exactly how they worked. The swap he had gone to had been one when Heather was still kind of freaked out about meeting Stephen alone. Mike had driven to the Target with her, and he ran into the store to grab a few things before Stephen got there. But by the time he was leaving the store, Stephen had arrived and was handing the baby to Heather. So Mike had just hung back and watched from a distance. Lieutenant Downs sat quietly, just looking at Mike for a minute. This was a guy who fit the description of the killer, at least in part. He also knew exactly where Heather would be at the time of the shooting, and he most likely knew the layout of the Target parking lot and the surrounding area, because he had been there before. So, Downs asked Mike if there had been any problems or tension lately between him and Heather. But Mike said he loved Heather, and that their relationship was awesome. They almost never fought, and they had even been talking about having kids and buying a house together. Not long after that, Downs finished up the interview and told Mike he was free to go. On the surface, Mike had seemed to be telling the truth about his and Heather's relationship, but that definitely wasn't enough for Downs to eliminate him as a suspect. After all, boyfriends could get jealous and do really stupid things, even if they were in a good relationship. And Downs knew if he could just get a clearer picture of the man from the surveillance video, he would know if Mike was the shooter or not. After the interview with Mike, Downs called the security director at Target to see when the enhanced images from the video would be ready. The security director said he had sent the footage off to the lab, but it would take at least a week for the lab technicians to finish their work. The idea of waiting around to get these images did not sit well with Downs. He wanted to keep moving forward, and he knew there had been a whole parking lot full of people who had at least caught a glimpse of the suspected killer. That evening, still only about 24 hours after the murder, Downs had his team bring in as many people who had witnessed the shooting as they could. And Downs had all these witnesses sit with a sketch artist who then drew a composite based on the descriptions of the killer that the witnesses provided. But when Downs and the other investigators saw the completed drawing, they thought it might be a joke. This killer with the huge hair and big mustache looked like a caricature, or like Sonny Bono, the famous singer from the 1960s and 70s. But all of the witnesses looked at the drawing, and every one of them swore that was what the killer looked like. Downs was pretty sure he was not looking for a famous singer, so he resigned himself to the fact that he was going to have to wait for the images from the lab to get a clear picture of what this man really looked like. And this frustrated him, because he felt like until he had those images, he and his team would just be sort of treading water. But the next day, 2 days after the murder, Downs was in his office going over his notes when an officer rushed in and said he needed to come quick. A phone call had just come into the tip line, and the caller said he had seen the killer up close. Downs didn't hesitate. He got up, walked across the station, and grabbed the phone from the officer who was manning the tip line. Downs quickly introduced himself and asked the caller to tell him everything. The caller said he happened to be at that hotel that was right by the target on the day before the shooting, and he had seen this really strange-looking guy lingering in the hotel parking lot. But that wasn't all. This weird guy was clearly staking out the area. He was looking through a pair of binoculars, and then he took a bunch of photos. And then when the guy was done taking the photos, he hopped in a Ford F-150 pickup truck and took off. Downs, who prided himself on almost always remaining calm, felt a huge rush of excitement. He asked the caller if he managed to get the truck's license plate number. But the caller said he didn't. However, he said the truck was white, and it had a really distinctive black trim all around it. Downs got even more excited. A license plate number would have been perfect, but this description was still huge. Downs got the caller's info and then hung up the phone. He quickly gathered his team, and they ran a search through motor vehicle records for all the white Ford F-150s registered in the county. And when Downs saw the name of one of the people who owned a Ford F-150 in town, he thought he might have just found Heather's killer. Later that afternoon, Lieutenant Downs drove through a quiet suburban neighborhood with the hotel witness sitting next to him in the passenger seat. Downs spotted the house he was looking for and stopped the car. He pointed to the white truck parked in the driveway, and the hotel witness looked at it through the passenger side window. And when he saw it, the witness immediately said that that was the truck he'd seen the strange-looking man get into at the hotel. There was no mistaking the distinct black trim all around it. Downs said that was great news. He thanked the witness for coming along, then he hit the gas and sped away from the house. The following day, which was only 3 days after the shooting, police got a search warrant for the house where the white truck was parked, and they impounded the truck and brought it in for a forensics search. And the forensics team quickly discovered that the truck had clearly been recently cleaned, because it was absolutely immaculate inside. This made it difficult for them to find anything useful in the truck, so they sent it to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's lab to undergo trace evidence testing, hoping the state lab might be able to find something that they couldn't. In the meantime, Downs and his team cataloged everything they had taken when they searched the house where the white truck had been found. And the more evidence Downs saw, the more confident he became that he had found the killer. Still, Downs wanted to make sure his case was airtight before he made an arrest. He didn't want to bring the killer into police custody just to have the district attorney's office tell him that the case wasn't strong enough to argue in court. But Downs didn't have to wait too long to get another big piece of evidence. A little over a week after the murder, the Target lab sent the enhanced surveillance images to Downs. And as the lieutenant looked at these images, he saw something that he believed would help him close this case. On the afternoon that Lieutenant Downs got the images, he led Heather's estranged husband, Stephen, into one of the station's interview rooms. Downs sat Stephen down at a table that had a laptop sitting on it. Downs flipped open the laptop and pulled up several images. He told him that these were enhanced images that had been pulled from Target surveillance footage taken on the evening Heather was killed. Downs leaned in and asked Stephen if he recognized the man with the big hair and the mustache in the images. Stephen stared at the screen, and then he dropped his head and looked down at the floor. Without looking up at Downs, he just said he did recognize this man. Lieutenant Downs felt like this investigation had just been wrapped up in a nice little bow. He knew it would still take time to compile all the evidence and put together the strongest case possible, but in that moment, Downs was sure that he knew who killed Heather Strube. Based on the parking lot surveillance images, suspect and witness interviews, and evidence collected throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Heather on the evening of April 26, 2009. At around 6 p.m., the killer crouched down behind a row of parked cars at the edge of the Target parking lot, tightened the messenger bag slung over their shoulder, and watched Heather and Stephen's custody swap. When Heather started putting baby Carson into her car, the killer began walking fast right towards her. Heather heard the killer's footsteps approaching, and she turned around to see this bizarre-looking man standing there. The killer spoke, and it frightened Heather. So much so that she turned and tried to open up her driver's side door to get away, but the killer immediately pushed themselves between Heather and her SUV, and then before Heather could even call out for help, the killer reached into their bag, pulled out a revolver, pressed the muzzle right against Heather's forehead, and squeezed the trigger. There was a deafening bang, and then Heather crumpled to the ground as blood began to pour from the wound in her head. The killer heard screaming coming from all of the shoppers who had just witnessed this, but the killer did not panic. Instead, they turned and calmly walked across the Target parking lot, through the surrounding woods, and into the nearby hotel parking lot. There, the killer got into their truck that they had left parked right there, they drove off, and pulled onto the highway. Once the killer was far enough away, they peeled off their fake mustache and removed their wig. A cheap disguise, but one they knew would conceal their identity. Because neither Heather's husband nor her boyfriend killed her. Her mother-in-law, Joanna, did. It turned out Stephen's mother, Joanna, did not like Heather at all. And she had told different people on several occasions that she did not think Heather was a good mother and that Heather should not have custody of Carson. Now, Joanna was not anywhere near the top of Lieutenant Downs' suspect list when the investigation started. After all, he thought he was searching for a strange-looking man. But then, Downs discovered that the distinctive white Ford F-150 truck was registered to Joanna. And when that truck was sent to the state lab for further testing, they lifted a single fiber from the truck's interior, and that fiber was determined to be synthetic hair, most likely from a wig. So Downs started to rethink everything. Maybe that strange-looking man on the surveillance video, the suspected killer, was really a woman in disguise. And when he saw the enhanced images from Target's lab and rewatched the entire surveillance video, he was sure he was right, and that Joanna was the person in the wig and fake mustache. And when Downs showed the surveillance images to Stephen, he recognized his mother through the disguise. But even after that, Downs and his team wanted to lock their case down further, and they eventually discovered that Joanna had owned a .38 caliber Rossi revolver. Now, Joanna's gun was never actually found, but ballistics tests confirmed that a .38 caliber Rossi was one of only 2 types of revolvers that could have fired the bullet that killed Heather. And with that final piece of information, Downs and his team made their arrest. Joanna was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison with possibility of parole in 30 years. She was prohibited from having any contact with Heather's family, including her grandson, Carson. Heather's parents were granted full custody of Carson and are raising him themselves, but they do make sure he continues to have a relationship with his father, Stephen Strube. Police do not believe that Stephen had anything to do with Heather's murder, or that he knew his mother was involved. That is, until he saw the surveillance footage. On the afternoon of July 18, 1997, a man was driving down a road surrounded on both sides by trees in a rural part of Wisconsin called Douglas County. There were no other cars on the road, and so this guy was driving pretty fast. And as he rounded this bend in the road, something out the passenger side window on the side of the road in the grass caught his eye. He couldn't tell what it was, but it was a pretty big object, and after he drove right past it, he just couldn't stop thinking about it. Like, whatever it was, it just seemed out of place. And so for whatever reason, this man felt compelled to actually stop and go see what it was. And so he slowed down and parked on the shoulder. He got out and began walking along the road back in the direction of this object. And as he got closer, he began to see this object again in the shoulder of the road, and it was sort of obscured by grass and other things, so he couldn't see what it was. But as he got closer, he saw the object was pretty big, and it was all white. And as he took a few more steps and got within maybe 20 or 30 feet, he finally got a better look at this object, and he just froze. Because the object was a man wearing all white, a white suit, a white belt, white shoes, all white, and he was laying on the side of the road, just totally motionless. And for a second, the driver thought, maybe this guy is sleeping. But after taking only a few more steps and getting a totally unobstructed view at this guy, he saw there was a gaping hole in this man's chest. He was obviously dead. And so the driver turned around, ran back to his car, sped to the nearest house, and called 911. The next morning, a Douglas County detective named Stephen Long was sitting at his desk looking at the photos of the dead man in white. This murder case was less than 24 hours old, but already this was one of the weirder cases that this detective had ever been assigned to. The victim had pretty much immediately been identified because he was carrying on his person his wallet, and in his wallet was his driver's license, and so they knew who he was. But the man in white's identity actually made the whole case more confusing, not less. And Mark had no obvious ties to the area, so what was this rich guy doing 3 hours from home, dressed all in white, getting shot to death on the side of the road? Like, it didn't add up. The dead man was a 45-year-old millionaire named Mark Foster, and Mark lived 3 hours away in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and had no discernible ties to Douglas County. And so the detective was thinking, what is this rich guy doing here, dressed head to toe, all in white, getting murdered on the side of some local random back road? But things only got more confusing from there. After the medical examiner did Mark's autopsy, he told Detective Long that he had discovered a note inside of Mark's shoe. And the note just said, "Jack Frazier isn't here, but it's Jimmy Bailey, or a look-alike? I hope I'm okay." Now, nobody, including Detective Long, had any idea what this note meant. It was far too cryptic. But when they ran Jack Frazier and Jimmy Bailey's names through their database, the police discovered that both of those men, one, existed, and two, they lived in Minnesota, same as Mark Foster. And so naturally, Detective Long began to suspect that maybe those two men were connected in some way to Mark Foster. Maybe they were involved in his murder, or maybe they were actually his killer or killers. He didn't know, but it was his best lead. So Detective Long decided he would just have to go to Minneapolis to try to find out more. A few hours later, Detective Long parked his car at the Minneapolis police station. He got out and walked inside the building. Waiting for him inside was the local detective who Mark had already spoken to. And so after meeting this detective, the two of them went into an interview room where Mark Foster's wife was waiting for them. And right away, Detective Long noticed that she was very pregnant and at least 15 or 20 years younger than Mark. But despite that, she seemed very composed. It would turn out she had already been told about her husband's death, and she was basically resigned to the fact that she was here to try to answer questions to figure out what happened. And so the detective sat down and they began to interview her. And then when they brought up the note that was found in Mark's shoe, specifically when they said the two names that were on that note, Jack Frazier and Jimmy Bailey, when they said that, it triggered something in Mark Foster's wife. She immediately began to cry, and then in between sobs, she would tell the detectives that she knew who those two men were. She told them that she had previously had relationships with both of them before marrying Mark. And she said after she married Mark, Jack and Jimmy became very jealous. They didn't like the idea that she had chosen Mark over them. And so she had always felt like those two, Jack and Jimmy, sort of had it out for Mark as a result of this romantic rivalry. After the interview with Mark's wife ended, Detective Long began to think that, despite this case appearing on the surface to be very odd and confusing, that perhaps in reality, it was quite simple. Maybe Jimmy and Jack were so jealous of Mark that they killed Mark. I mean, based on what Mark's wife had just told them in the interview about them being romantic rivals of Mark, and also the fact that that note was in Mark's shoe and named those two men, it certainly seemed very possible. But over the next couple of days that Detective Long began digging into this theory, that theory fell apart. Because it would turn out Jack Frazier and Jimmy Bailey had absolutely airtight alibis. They simply couldn't have been the killers. Now, Detective Long was obviously frustrated. He felt like he really had it here. But he was not deterred. He decided his next move would be to try to better understand his victim. To this point, he had already interviewed a lot of Mark's friends and family, but something he had not done yet was simply go to Mark's house and have a look around. So Detective Long got a search warrant, and on July 29th, roughly a week after Mark was killed, Detective Long, along with another detective, pulled up in front of Mark Foster's large 2-story home in the middle of a quiet suburban neighborhood. Now, from the outside, the home looked totally ordinary relative to its neighbors. But once they got inside the house, it was anything but. The detectives made their way up to the front door and knocked, and a few seconds later, Mark Foster's wife opened up the door and let them inside. And right away, Detective Long is looking around, and he's seeing all over the walls on the first floor of the house are these graphic pictures and paintings of naked people. And then in addition to that, on some of the coffee tables and various surfaces on the first floor, right when you walk in, are all these pornographic magazines and books everywhere. And Mark's wife didn't acknowledge any of it. She acted like it was completely normal to have all this stuff right in the front part of your house. And so the two detectives are looking at each other as, Mark's wife is leading them on this tour through the first floor. And at some point, Detective Long just said, "Hey, Mrs. Foster, why don't you have a seat on the couch and you just let us take a look around your house on our own?" And so she said, okay. She sat down on the couch, and then the two detectives, they left the living room, went back to the front of the house, and made their way upstairs. And once they got upstairs, they found the master suite, and there was all this bondage gear inside. There were leather straps attached to the bedposts, there was whips and handcuffs, there was also additional pornographic material in there. But, considering what the detectives had seen downstairs, this sort of felt on par for this house. And so after searching the other bedrooms and other rooms on the second floor and finding more pornographic material basically everywhere, the detectives found their way back to the hallway in the second floor, and they noticed there was a rope hanging down from the ceiling, and it was attached to the pull door that led to the attic. And so the two detectives, they walked over, they pulled the rope down, it revealed this fold-out set of stairs that came down from the attic, and once those were in place, the two detectives began climbing up. And once they got up there, they discovered that this attic was not a storage space like many attics are in American homes. Instead, this attic was a fully functional room that sort of resembled like a satanic dungeon of sorts. All the walls were totally jet black, and there were all these burned out candles all over the place and tarot cards littering the floor. And on the back of the attic, basically all the way on the other side, there was what appeared to be an altar that sort of overlooked the entire room. And on the altar were more candles, and there was a voodoo doll. It's totally creepy, and the two detectives are looking at each other like, what's going on here? And so the detectives, they climbed all the way into the attic, and then slowly began walking across towards the altar. And when they got close enough to actually see the altar up close, they just froze. Because sitting on the altar, in addition to the candles and the voodoo doll, were two business cards. Their own business cards. Detective Long and his partner immediately went downstairs and confronted Mark's wife about the attic. Like, what's going on up there? Why are our business cards on your altar? But Mark's wife, the second that attic was mentioned, went silent. She refused to speak about anything to do with the attic. And so after a minute, realizing this conversation was going nowhere, Detective Long and his partner called for backup. And as they waited for backup, the two of them stepped away from Mark's wife and began speculating like, is this a cult? Was Mark a part of a cult that ran it out of his attic? What's going on here? And are we being targeted by the cult? Is that why our names are on the altar? A few minutes later, backup arrived, and they would do a much more extensive search of the property. But other than finding more pornographic materials and, bondage gear, there really wasn't anything else substantive that connected Mark or his wife to what happened to Mark, or what Mark was even doing in this house. Was he in a cult? They didn't know. And so ultimately, Detective Long and his partner told Mark's wife, who still is being quiet at this point, that she should not leave town because they were going to follow up with her soon. Now, in fairness, Detective Long couldn't tell if Mark's wife was being silent and not talking about what was going on in her house because, she was complicit in some way in what happened to Mark, or if she was maybe being threatened by somebody and she was afraid to talk. They didn't know. But either way, after leaving the property after the search was over, Detective Long and his partner felt like their next move was to try to learn more about cults. They needed a cult expert. And it just so happened there was an occult bookstore very close to Mark's house. And so they decided they would start there. And right away, their decision to go to that bookstore paid dividends, but not how the detectives expected. It would turn out the owner of that bookstore was indeed a cult expert. But much more importantly, and relevant to this case, was that the owner happened to personally know Mark Foster. And he told the detectives that Mark came to his bookstore all the time, and also the owner said he knew a bunch of Mark's friends. And so by the time the detectives left the bookstore, they had learned a little bit about cults, but more importantly, they left with a list of names the owner had given them of known associates of Mark Foster who maybe were involved in whatever was going on in Mark's house, and so maybe they had information about what happened to Mark. The detectives were able to track down everybody on this list very quickly, and they were all young people in their 20s. And in each of the interviews they conducted, each of these young people were very open about being in what they called a religious group that they said Mark was a part of as well. Now, the detectives theorized that this religious group was very likely a cult, like they believed, but they didn't call it a cult. They called it a group. But the detectives didn't let up. They kept pressing these people until eventually a new name surfaced, Greg Freisner. Now, none of these people said Greg was in charge of the cult. Instead, they just sort of said, well, talk to Greg if you want more information about our group. The detectives naturally began to wonder if this Greg person was the cult leader, or maybe he was Mark's killer, or maybe he was both. But regardless, it seemed pretty apparent that they needed to talk to Greg because he might have more information about what happened to Mark. It took a few days, but the detectives were able to track Greg down, and they brought him in for an interview. And boy, oh boy, did Greg have a story to tell. Based on what Greg told the detectives, here is what happened to Mark on the day that he died, on July 18th, 1997. On that day, Greg Freisner met Mark Foster at Mark's home. And when Mark came outside, he was dressed head to toe in white, something he would do for special ceremonies. And so Mark, he came down the steps, didn't say a word to Greg. They went to Greg's car. Greg hopped in the driver's seat, and Mark climbed into the back seat. And before long, they took off and began driving northeast. And for hours, these two just drove in total silence. Mark just stared out the window, and Greg focused on driving. The only thing that happened during this multi-hour-long drive was at some point Mark pulled out a piece of paper from his coat pocket, and he wrote something on it, and then after staring at it, he kind of smiled and tucked it into his shoe. And then a little bit later, Greg pulled over on the side of the road in Douglas County, Wisconsin, on this random backcountry road. And as soon as they pulled over, again without saying anything, Greg and Mark got out of the car, and they went around to the back of the car where the trunk was. And the two men are kind of stretching, it's been a long drive, taking in the scenery. And then before long, Greg pops open the trunk. And in the trunk is a rifle. Neither men have any strong reaction to this. Greg just reaches down, pulls the rifle out, and Mark, calm as can be, just begins walking over to the side of the road, to the shoulder. And then once he got to the shoulder, Greg came over and stood right in front of him and just looked intently into Mark's eyes, looking for the signal. And at some point, after Mark kind of composed himself, he nodded at Greg, at which point Greg raised that rifle, placed the barrel directly on Mark's chest, and fired. Mark crumpled to the ground, and he laid there for a second just moaning horribly, and Greg just stood over him watching until finally Mark went silent and died, at which point Greg casually went back to his car, got inside, and drove home. The only time he stopped was to throw his rifle into a nearby river. But once Greg got home, he was overjoyed because he knew the sacred ritual he had just carried out with Mark had been a total success. It had gone exactly to plan. It would turn out Mark Foster was absolutely a member of that religious group, the cult, if you will. Except he was not just a member. He was the cult's leader. And Mark is the one who orchestrated his own death. However, Mark did not view his death as him actually dying. Quite the opposite.
We celebrate life as we celebrate death. Death is nothing to be afraid of. Death is a great crossroads, a change in attitude, a change in longitude, a change in the way that we perceive our spirit. When we reach that portal, they'll ring some golden bells.
He believed that what he and Greg, his most devout follower, were going to do, this sacred ritual, was after Greg fires the shot into his chest and ends this body's life, that his soul, his consciousness, and his power will be transferred into Greg. Basically, his soul will go into Greg. And Mark believed once this transfer happened, that basically he would be immortal, that his soul would never die. It would stay in Greg and then maybe at some point get transferred to somebody else, but basically he would be here forever. The bizarre note that was found in Mark's shoe, the note that he wrote and stuffed in there, that note was designed to throw police off the trail. He knew that he was having Greg murder him, again for this ritual, but he wanted to make sure Greg didn't get caught. And so he wrote on the note very specifically Jack Frazier and Jimmy Bailey. Those two people he hated. He hated that they had been in past relationships with his wife, and they hated him. And so he figured if he was going to create a scapegoat for his murder, who better than his romantic rivals? They had nothing to do with it. He just named them in that cryptic note to get them in trouble. As for all the pornography and bondage gear that was found inside of Mark's home, well, that all played a role in Mark's cult as well. He was a firm believer that the more sex he had with his followers, often multiple followers at the same time, the more powerful he would become. As for the detective's business cards found on the altar up in the attic, those were very likely placed there by followers of Mark, so members of the cult, in an effort to potentially, thwart their efforts to solve the case. They might have believed that by placing those on there and performing various rituals, that somehow would prevent them from solving the case. We don't know for sure. That's the theory around why they were there, but obviously that didn't work because the detectives solved the case. Greg Freisner would ultimately be found guilty for playing a role in Mark's death. He obviously was the trigger man, and so he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. As for Mark's wife, although she definitely knew about the cult and may have been a participant, there was never any evidence that actually connected her to Mark's murder, and so she was never charged with any crime. At 1 p.m. on November 2nd, 2020, an older man named Marcel Terray stood in his backyard hanging damp clothes on a clothesline. Marcel and his wife, 83-year-old Paulette Landru, lived on a quiet street in the small city of Anden, Belgium. And usually their days were filled with household chores or visits from their kids. But over the last few months, Marcel had started to spend a lot more time taking care of his wife because she had recently been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease is a type of dementia that causes memory loss and confusion. And so Paulette needed help remembering to eat or to take her medications on time. And sometimes she would just wander off without telling Marcel, and Marcel would have to go corral her and bring her back home. For Marcel, watching his wife struggle with this disease was absolutely heartbreaking, and so he did everything in his power to make her life as comfortable and happy as he possibly could. And so before he had come out to hang up the laundry, he had made sure to set his wife up in front of the TV with a nice lunch so she could eat and watch her favorite show. And so Marcel hung up the last piece of clothing and then picked up the empty laundry basket and headed back towards the house. When he went inside, he expected to see his wife still sitting on the couch watching TV. But she wasn't there anymore. Marcel immediately began calling out his wife's name, but she didn't call back. And then he searched the whole house and he couldn't find her. And so starting to panic, he went outside, he searched the outside of the house, she wasn't there. He even knocked on some neighbors' doors, but they hadn't seen her. And so at this point, Marcel was very scared, given the fact that his wife had Alzheimer's and could easily wander off and put herself in a very dangerous situation without even knowing. And so instead of waiting any longer to just hope she showed up again, he picked up the phone and he called the police. Less than an hour later, Marcel stood outside of his house looking at helicopters flying overhead, and he knew at least half a dozen officers were spread out around the neighborhood, knocking on neighbors' doors. There were canine units searching the surrounding area. This huge search, it was all for Paulette. Marcel was glad to see that clearly the police had taken the search very seriously, and so he was confident that they would find his wife and that hopefully she'd be okay. But the hours kept ticking by, and as the sun began to go down, there still was no sign of Paulette. A police officer told Marcel that they would keep on investigating and hopefully find his wife as soon as possible. But over the next few days and weeks, Paulette didn't turn up, nobody had any idea where she was, and before long, weeks turned into months, and then months turned into 2 full years that nobody had seen Paulette. And by that point, Marcel had basically resigned himself to the fact that he very likely would die without ever figuring out what happened to his wife. But then, one day in early October of 2022, so 2 years after Paulette went missing, one of Marcel and Paulette's neighbors was at home on their computer looking at a particular website. And as they were scrolling through this website, they happened upon an image that as soon as they saw it, they froze. Because this neighbor was very well aware of the fact that Paulette had gone missing and nobody had found her. But now they're seeing this image on this website that basically gives away what happened to her. And so totally shocked that they had even found this image, the neighbor screenshotted it and brought it to the police. So it would turn out that neighbor was looking at Google Street View. which is a feature of Google Maps that basically allows you to see 360-degree views of basically anywhere on the planet. To create these images, Google literally sends out these special vehicles all over the world that have cameras that sit on top of the cars. And these cars drive down basically all the streets all over the place, constantly taking pictures all around them. And it just so happened on the exact day that Paulette went missing in 2020, there happened to be a Google car driving down the road that captured a picture of her. And so as you can see in the picture of her, you see Paulette on the left side of the image walking across the street away from her home, which is on the right side. And on the right side, you can actually see Marcel in the backyard hanging up laundry on the clothesline. And so the police, after getting this image, they basically followed the projected route Paulette was on, which is basically beelining straight across the road. And they found that across the street was this steep hill that led down to this thick bramble bush. And inside of that bramble bush was Paulette, and she was deceased. And so very likely, Paulette, in her confused state, walked straight across the street, as we see in the image, and then fell down that hill and got trapped at the bottom inside of that bramble bush and couldn't move. And so when that huge search for her was going on, very likely she was just trapped down there, but didn't understand what was going on, couldn't necessarily yell up to communicate with anybody. And so she stayed down there and died. And unfortunately, it would take 2 more full years and a random image on Google Street View before Marcel could finally get the closure he needed. Around 10 a.m. on July 26, 2015, a 31-year-old mom named Xiang Lu Xuan and her husband chased their 2-year-old son around a brand new indoor playground. This playground was on the 6th floor of a mall in Jingzhou City, which is in central China. And so Xiang and her husband had come to this mall today just so their son could basically enjoy this playground. And currently he was running around in circles and laughing hysterically. He thought it was great. Xiang caught up to her son and scooped him up and then placed him at the top of a slide. And he happily slid down to the bottom, and when he reached the bottom, Xiang was waiting for him, and the son, he just stopped and looked past her and pointed and started saying, "Ride, ride." And so Xiang, she turned around and she saw right behind them were these 2 escalators, one going up and one going down. And so Xiang realized her son clearly thought these escalators were maybe a part of this playground. And so he wanted to go use them. They were a fun attraction. And so Xiang smiled and took her son's hand and then told her husband they're going to go ride the ride, the escalators. And then they began walking over. Once Xiang and her son actually reached the escalator, suddenly her son was not as keen to hop on board. He was nervous. But Xiang, who had ridden escalators many times before, told her son it's totally safe, and she kind of coaxed him to do it. And eventually, he stepped on right alongside her, holding her hand. And about halfway up the escalator, when she was confident her son would be okay, Xiang turned around and looked up towards the top of the escalator, the 7th floor where they were going. And she saw 3 mall employees at the top of the escalator on the 7th floor where they were going. And they were clearly looking at Xiang with a very serious look on their faces, and they were gesturing at something towards the top of the escalator. It seemed like they could be warning her about something or simply pointing something out. She wasn't really sure. And so she looked up at them like, what's going on here? But the 3 mall employees just didn't do a good job communicating whatever was going on or whatever issue they were dealing with. And so as a result, Xiang and her son just continued riding up the escalator, and as they got closer and closer, these mall employees continued to gesture at something happening on the 7th floor just beyond the escalator, and Xiang still totally confused. And then finally, when Xiang and her son reached the top and stepped off, Xiang suddenly understood what these employees were referencing, but by now, it was too late. Moments later, Xiang's husband, who was still down below on the 6th floor at the playground, he heard the sound of his wife and son screaming over near the escalator. And so instinctively, he bolted over to the escalator. He didn't see his wife, didn't see his son, and he began going up the escalator when someone at the top screamed at him to stop and get off the escalator. And so he did, and right then, a mall employee came running down the other side carrying his son, and this person handed the son over to Xiang's husband. And this employee, who clearly was completely shocked by whatever had happened up above, just shook their head. It would turn out, earlier that day, those mall employees who were at the top gesturing to Jiang, they had discovered a defect with the metal platform that sits right at the top of the escalator on the 7th floor. Basically, when you get off this escalator, it's the platform you step onto first. They had found there was something wrong with it. It wasn't stable. But instead of immediately blocking off the escalator to make sure nobody walked on it and then go get it repaired, these employees just kind of nonchalantly allowed the escalator to continue, stationed a couple of them at the top to make sure nobody, used the escalator, and then called for a repairman. But the repairman hadn't shown up and fixed this problem by the time Jiang and her son boarded the escalator. And these employees at the top knew there's this huge issue with the platform they're going to step on the second they get off, but they failed to communicate the danger to Jiang and her son as they were coming up. They just kind of broadly gesticulated that there was some issue up here and to sort of watch out for it, but Jiang had no idea. And so by the time she got to the top and stepped off the escalator onto that platform, well, the defect with the platform is that it caved in with any weight. And so she fell into the escalator where the teeth of the escalator was rotating, and as she was getting pulled in to her death, her final moment captured on video as she took her son and thrusted him to the employees, saving his life before she disappeared and died inside the inner workings of the escalator. Following Jiang's death, there was a full-scale investigation, and quickly there were massive safety failures identified on the part of the company who made the escalator and also on the mall itself. 2 people were ultimately arrested in connection with Jiang's death and these safety failures, and the mall reportedly offered to pay some settlement to Jiang's family. However, the details of that settlement have not been made public. One morning in November of 1997, a police captain named Jeffrey Lewis, along with his partner, parked their squad car near the Manatee River in Bradenton, Florida, which is a small city just south of Tampa. A few minutes earlier, the Bradenton Police Department had received a call from this frantic man who had said he had found something suspicious that had washed up on the shore of this river. And so Captain Lewis and his partner were there to investigate. And so as soon as they got out of their squad car, this man who had called the police, he saw them and waved them down, and he was pointing at something in the sand. And so Captain Lewis and his partner, they walked over, and before they even talked to this guy, they just looked down at what he was pointing at, and right away they could see why he called the police. Because there, sitting on the sand, was a severed human hand. And so the instant Captain Lewis saw this, his first thought was actually just alligators, because there were alligators that swam in the Manatee River, and people were told about them and were told, not to go swimming here, but people still did. And so his thought was, well, maybe one of the alligators got a swimmer. However, when Captain Lewis looked at the hand more closely, he could tell right away that that probably did not happen, because where the hand had been cut off from the body, the cut was almost surgical. It was very, very neat, whereas if an alligator had ripped the hand off, it would be rough. But this almost looked like a surgeon had carefully removed the hand. And so what this signaled to Captain Lewis is this hand very likely represented a murder victim. Somebody who killed this person, cut their body up, and one of their body parts is now washed ashore. And so Captain Lewis turned to his partner and told him to call for backup. And within an hour, police officers were scouring the Manatee River looking for the body that belonged to this hand. Meanwhile, the captain bagged this hand as evidence and brought it to the county sheriff's crime lab, hoping that forensic experts could potentially figure out who the victim was using fingerprints. However, when he actually handed over the hand to these forensic technicians, they told Captain Lewis that it was very likely going to be impossible to try to pull prints from this hand because the hand was very badly decomposed and water damaged. But they told Captain Lewis that despite this being a total long shot, they would still give it a try. And so really all Captain Lewis had was this hand, and so he just kind of waited for information from the crime lab about the fingerprints. And before long, the waiting went from days to weeks to months, with no fingerprints. And so with no fingerprints and no other breakthroughs in this case, Captain Lewis moved on to other cases. That is, until June of 1998, when Captain Lewis was sitting in his office doing some work, when he suddenly got a call from the crime lab about the hand. An employee told Captain Lewis they had finally made a breakthrough. When they couldn't get the prints off this hand at first, they had moved to this very complicated technique where basically they would peel individual layers of skin off the hand and sort of piece together all the information to get a print. And amazingly, this technique worked. And so not only did they now have this print, but they had also already run this print through the Florida State database, and they had gotten a match. The hand belonged to a man named Willie Suttle. As soon as he hung up, Captain Lewis opened up a new tab on his computer and began researching Willie Suttle to figure out who this person was. And he quickly found through public employment records that Willie had been a retired garbage collector, and then also Captain Lewis looked at police records and discovered that Willie had a minor criminal history. But what really stood out in his research about Willie was that Willie had never been reported missing. Willie had instead been reported dead. Right there in the public records that Captain Lewis was looking at, he found Willie's death certificate. And this document said Willie had died of natural causes 5 months prior to his hand washing up on shore. And also it said Willie had been buried in a local cemetery, and no police had ever been involved in his death because no crime had been committed. And so Captain Lewis was baffled. None of this made any sense. If Willie had died of natural causes and been buried over a year ago, then how did his hand, his severed hand, wind up on the shore of the Manatee River? The next day, which was Friday, June 26th, Captain Lewis, along with a few other police officers, went to the cemetery where Willie had been buried, and they exhumed his casket. And when they opened it up, they actually expected it to be empty, considering his hand was already missing, so probably his whole body was gone. But no, when they opened it up, there was Willie, missing his left hand. But that wasn't all. At the bottom of Willie's casket were all of his internal organs, just sitting there in a rotting pile. And so Captain Lewis is staring at this, having no idea what to make of it. But the first thought he had was, okay, maybe somebody tried to rob Willie's casket. But he's thinking, if they did that, why did they cut out his organs and stash them at the bottom of the casket? And also, why did they remove his left hand and chuck it in the river? Like, that doesn't make any sense. It felt like every clue Captain Lewis found was only making this case harder to solve. But he hoped when he sent off Willie's body to the county medical examiner that they would be able to provide him with some more answers as to what happened here. Later that afternoon, the county medical examiner would perform an autopsy on Willie's body. And the first thing he noticed when he began was that despite the fact that Willie's organs clearly had been removed, that Willie's abdomen did not appear sunken in. It appeared full. So the medical examiner started the autopsy by cutting open Willie's abdomen to see what was in there. And when he saw what was inside of Willie, he just froze, having no idea how to react to what he was looking at. He had never seen anything like this in his entire career, not even close. And so the medical examiner just grabbed a camera, took some pictures of Willie's midsection, and sent those pictures to Captain Lewis. The next day, Captain Lewis sat inside of an interview room in the police station across from a 45-year-old woman named Paula Green Albritton. Paula owned and operated a funeral home along with the help of her son, and she had been the one responsible for Willie Suttle's burial. And so Captain Lewis asked Paula about Willie's burial, and she would tell him that Willie had actually died in poverty, without any family members to help cover his burial expenses. However, when Paula had found out about this, she said she had agreed to do the burial anyways, for no cost, as sort of a community service. However, when Captain Lewis poked and prodded and tried to ask for more information about exactly what that meant, Paula would eventually concede that there actually was slightly more to her rationale behind wanting to do Willie's burial. It was not just for charity. 2 days after this interview, police arrested both Paula and her son. And at Paula's trial, the truth surrounding what happened to Willie finally came out. It would turn out Paula's funeral home business was really struggling, to the point where if she couldn't start generating some real money, her business might go under. And she couldn't have that. And so Paula decided she would conduct a prosperity ritual to right her business. But to perform this prosperity ritual, Paula needed a body. And so along comes Willie Suttle, who's died in poverty and his family can't afford his funeral. And Paula says, don't worry, I'll take him on for free. But really what she needed was Willie's body. And once Paula and her son had possession of Willie's body, they began the ritual, which started with Paula's son carefully cutting off Willie's left hand. And then the two of them cut Willie's midsection open, removed all his internal organs. And then Paula got out all these voodoo dolls, and she wrote on pieces of paper the names of the other funeral homes, her competitors in the area, and she pinned these pieces of paper to each of these voodoo dolls.
and then she took those voodoo dolls and jammed them inside of Willie's abdomen in the empty cavity they had created, and then they stitched him back up. And then she took Willie's body and his organs, and she chucked them into a cheap casket and had him buried. And then she also took the hand that her son had removed, she put it inside of a plastic bag, added some weight to it, and chucked it into the Manatee River. Paula believed this voodoo ritual would literally cause the owners of the other funeral homes, whose businesses she wrote down on the dolls and jammed inside of Willie's body, that this ritual would literally cause all of them to be struck down and killed, putting their businesses out of business, thereby leading to her business prospering once again. However, none of these things came to fruition. The ritual did not work the way Paula intended it to. Instead, the hand that she had thrown into the river ultimately washed ashore, and before long, the police figured out what Paula and her son had done. In 1999, so 2 years after Willie's hand had washed up on shore, Paula and her son were found guilty of desecrating Willie's corpse. Paula's son ultimately served 1 year in prison. As for Paula, her conviction was actually quickly overturned due to a technicality. It was discovered that during an interview with Paula, that police detectives told her that she could not be convicted if this ritual was part of a religious practice, that she was protected under the US Constitution. And so Paula, who confessed to doing this ritual, did so by saying it was part of her religion. She practiced voodoo.
I am a voodooist, and I've survived because I know how to survive. And that's a part of my religion.
And so in court, that confession was ruled inadmissible. And so she walked free. Here is a photo of the 12 voodoo dolls found inside of Willie's body, with the notes Paula wrote cursing her competition still attached.
Today's story is a good old-fashioned scary story that you might tell around a campfire. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please superglue 50 harmonicas to the front of the like button's car right before they leave for work. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the afternoon of Sunday, February 25th, 1855, a 48-year-old woman named Hannah Rallinson, along with her husband and a group of her friends, walked quickly down a road in Sheffield, England. As they walked, the entire group was totally silent because they were terrified of what was going to happen next. Behind Hannah and her friends on this road was actually another slightly larger group of people that were keeping pace with Hannah and her friends. They were actually going to the same place as them, except this second group had no intention of going inside that building. They were just there to see what happened. Now, Hannah and her friends were totally offended and annoyed by this group that was following them, but they knew there was nothing they could do, and so they just kept on walking in silence. And as Hannah walked in silence, she couldn't help but think to herself, how in the world did I get into this position? At the time, Sheffield, England was a big industrial city with lots of metalworking factories all over the place. And so loads of people at the time were coming to Sheffield to work in those factories. And as the population increased in Sheffield, the city began building all these tenement apartments, which are kind of like these low-quality, cramped, interconnected apartments that are basically cheap and easy to make and house lots and lots of people. Hannah and her husband lived in one of these tenement apartments, and they worked in one of the metalworking factories, which meant their lives were pretty rough and difficult. But recently, their lives had become even more challenging when their oldest son had died in a coal mining accident. And this totally devastated the parents, but Hannah definitely took it the worst. In her grief, Hannah became very antisocial and began just going to the factory and doing backbreaking labor all day, and then came straight home. She would go to a room by herself, and she would just sit there all night and pray and try to communicate with her dead son. Now, at first, Hannah's husband basically did the same thing as Hannah. He put all of his energy and his time and his focus on work, even though it was totally backbreaking and miserable, mainly because it was a distraction from this terrible grief he was dealing with. But after several weeks and months went by, Hannah's husband did begin to kind of get back to normal and began to move forward with his life. But he could see Hannah was not doing that. Hannah was totally depressed and isolated. And so he eventually encouraged her to start going back to church and start spending more time with people there, make some new friends, and hopefully being around some people will help you cope with this tragedy. And Hannah had actually taken her husband's advice. She began going back to church. She made a bunch of new friends. She rekindled old relationships. And before long, she was getting that support, and it was helping her kind of move through this grieving process. But ironically, it was this new church support group that had thrust Hannah into a new horrible situation, one that was playing out on the streets of Sheffield, England, as Hannah, her husband, and her church friends speed walked down the road with this big group following behind them. And so in this group of people with Hannah was obviously her husband, as well as her closest friend from church, whose name was Harriet Ward. And then also there was 3 members of the Favell family. There was Mr. and Mrs. Favell, as well as Mrs. Favell's sister. And all of them were headed to the tenement apartment on Campo Lane, where Harriet Ward and the Favell family lived together. Hannah and her group, and the second group that was following them, all came from the same place. They all went to the same church, and that day, for the previous 2 hours before they all took to the streets here, they had been having this really heated argument about what to do about Harriet and the Favell family's basement. Or, more specifically, what to do about what was in their basement. Some parishioners said that Harriet and the Favell family were just totally making up what was going on in their basement. But other parishioners believed them and said that that basement was so dangerous, nobody should go in it. In fact, we should just board up that basement permanently, or we should just level the entire tenement apartment building. And when that idea began gaining some traction, that lots of people in the church began saying, yeah, let's block off the basement or knock the apartment down, the Favell family and Harriet, who lived in this apartment building and did not want to, permanently block off segments of it or knock it down, they got so angry that they just stood up and left. And at this point, Hannah and her husband just got up and left with their friends. Now, once they got outside, they didn't really have a plan, but they felt strongly that they just needed to get to the Campo Lane tenement apartment building and at a minimum, just be in there to prevent other people from showing up and doing something to the apartment, like trying to knock it down or do something to the basement. And so Hannah and her group began speed walking to the apartment, and this gaggle of other churchgoers who were part of this argument just kind of naturally came outside and followed them. And then when Hannah and her friends reached the apartment building on Campo Lane, they went inside and shut and locked the door behind them. And for a moment, Hannah and the 5 other people she was with, they just stood there in silence, not really sure what to do next. But eventually, one of them said, we gotta do something about the basement, because if we don't, the people outside will. Hannah walked over to the front of the apartment where there was a big window that looked out to the street. And when she looked out there, she saw the big group of people that had followed them were all kind of gathering around the small window that looked down into the Campo Lane tenement apartment basement. It was like all these people were jockeying for position to get the best look. Hannah shut the blind in frustration and then walked back over to the group. And then after a few minutes, Mr. Favell said, guys, it's only going to be daylight for a few more hours. If we're going to do something in the basement, we have to get down there before the daylight is gone. We can't be down there in the dark. The group nodded because they understood why. They definitely did not want to be down there in the dark. And then Mr. Favell looked over at Hannah's husband and he kind of gestured like, why don't we, the 2 of us, go down there together? And Hannah's husband, even though he did not want to go down there, he just nodded and said, okay, let's go. Moments later, Hannah, Harriet, and the 2 Favell women watched as the 2 men opened up the basement door, turned around and looked at the women, and then they slowly began descending the stairs. And then after a couple of minutes, the only sound coming out of the basement was the sound of these 2 men using big metal tools to attempt to break up the stone floor in the basement. For the next 2 hours, Mr. Favell and Hannah's husband continued to smash up the floor in the basement, but every time they removed a big piece of stone, all they'd find was dirt underneath. There was nothing else. Meanwhile, outside, the crowd looking in that window into the basement was only getting bigger and bigger. It was no longer just other members of their church. It was now just random people who saw this big group and walked over to see what was going on. And Hannah, who was at that window looking out into the street, she was seeing this group growing and seeing how rowdy they were getting, and it was starting to make her really nervous. But the nerves she felt about the crowd were nothing compared to the nerves she felt about her husband and Mr. Favell still being in that basement now that the sun was about to set. She did not want them down there in the dark. And finally, when the sun did set and the two men still had not come up, Hannah just rushed over to the basement and yelled for them to stop what they were doing and get up here. And the two men did as she asked. They dropped their tools and came upstairs looking totally dejected. They had not found the thing they were looking for down there, which meant they had failed. But Hannah and her friends were hoping that now that it was dark outside and the people outside could no longer actually see into the basement because it was too dark, that maybe the crowd would disperse. But as Hannah, her husband, Harriet, and the Favells sat down to have some dinner in the apartment, they looked outside periodically and they saw the crowd was not going away. If anything, the crowd was still continuing to get bigger. Now, you got to remember, this is Sheffield, England in the 1800s. This was a tough place to live. Everybody's working at these factories, doing this awful work 7 days a week for very little money, and there's virtually no entertainment anywhere. It's basically just work, work, work until you die. And so when people in Sheffield saw this big group of people at night standing around this apartment window, it was exciting, and that was pretty rare in their lives, and so they were not about to leave and go home because their lives at home were terrible. And so, by about midnight, there was this huge crowd right outside of the Campo Lane apartment, and it meant that, Hannah and her husband really couldn't leave to go back to their apartment. They were kind of trapped because of this crowd. Also, the crowd was really starting to get rowdy, and the Favell family were starting to get worried that a fight would break out near the basement window, and then maybe the window would break, and then these people would storm into their apartment and maybe rob them. I mean, they didn't know. And so Mrs. Favell came up with this plan to try to get the crowd to leave them alone. And so she ran over to one of the biggest windows on the first floor, and she pulled down the curtain rod and the curtain attached to it, and she handed it to her sister and said, "Go down in the basement and use this curtain rod and curtain to block out the one window this crowd has to look into the basement. If they can't see into the basement, then they'll likely just leave." But Mrs. Favell's sister, after being handed this curtain rod, she's like, "I don't want to go in the basement. It's the middle of the night. I'm not going down there." And over the next couple of minutes, the entire group just kind of bickered about who should be the one to go down into the basement to cover up this window. And nobody wanted to do it. And finally, Hannah, who she's lost her son recently, she just wants to go home at this point, but she can't because of this stupid group. She finally just snaps and says, "You know what? I'll do it." And so she snatches the curtain rod and just walks right over to the basement door. She opens it up and begins descending the stairs before anybody else could stop her. And as she did, her husband and Harriet and the Favell family, they all crowded around the top of the basement stairs, looking down, kind of waiting to see what would happen. And so they all heard as Hannah turned the corner and walked over to that window, and they could hear her kind of messing around with the curtain as she put it in place. And then even though they could not see her down there, because the basement's totally dark, they can't see the window, they heard Hannah call out that she was done. She had put the curtain up, it's blocked, and now she was going to come back upstairs. But after she yelled to them that she was coming back up, it went completely silent in the basement. And for like 5, 6, 7 seconds, all the people at the top of the stairs are waiting anxiously for Hannah to turn the corner and come up the stairs to safety. But then this tense silence was broken with a horrible scream coming out of the basement. It was Hannah, and then silence again. And at this point, Hannah's husband, he's like, "Oh my God, something's happened." And he charges down the stairs and he looks over and he sees Hannah is lying on the ground motionless. There's nothing else in the basement. It's just his wife and this covered up window. And so he runs over, he scoops her up and he runs her back upstairs and he lays her on the ground right outside of the basement door. And then he began to shake her to try to wake her up, but she wasn't waking up. However, it was clear she was still breathing, and so Harriet ran and got a wet towel, and she came back and she kneeled down next to Hannah, and she placed the towel on Hannah's forehead, hoping this wet towel would revive Hannah. But as Harriet is kneeling there, so she's looking at Hannah's body, and the basement door, which is open, is right past Hannah's body, Harriet happened to look up, and so now she's looking into the doorway that leads down into the basement, and her eyes went wide, and she screamed, and then she passed out. The big controversy over this basement began several weeks earlier at the beginning of February when Harriet and the Favell family began hearing all these strange sounds coming out of the basement. Now, initially, they had totally written off these sounds as being, strange creaking and cracking sounds that were just the product of a poorly constructed building with lots of people inside of it. But the noises they were hearing from the basement only got louder and louder and more intense, and they were especially bad at night. And so basically, Harriet and the Favell family were so scared to go down there that they just stopped, especially at night. Sometimes they'd go during the day, but at night it was like, no one's going down there. We don't know what's going on, but I'm not going down there. And then on February 24th, so this is one day before all this craziness happened where, Hannah and her friends get followed to the apartment, and then Hannah goes down and she passes out, and then Harriet passes out. So one day before that, Harriet swore she saw a ghost in the basement. She saw this old woman wearing a white gown kind of moving around in the basement, and the whole time Harriet said this woman, this ghost woman, was pointing at one particular spot on the ground in the basement. And then the same night that Harriet sees this ghost in the basement, Harriet has a dream. And in her dream, she sees this ghost. And again, this ghost is in that basement and it's pointing at this spot on the basement floor. Except in Harriet's dream, this ghost woman speaks to Harriet and says that she was murdered and her gold was stolen from her and buried in the basement right there. And it was this apparent ghost in the Campo Lane basement that was the center of that 2-hour-long argument at the church the following day, which ultimately prompted Hannah, her husband, Harriet, the Favell family to get up and storm out to go protect the Campo Lane apartment. And then also the secondary group followed right after them, really just to see if they were going to go confront the ghost, because a lot of people thought that's what they're going to go do. And that is basically what Hannah, her husband, and her friends ended up doing. They decided the two men would go down into the basement and attempt to dig up the floor in hopes that they might find this gold that was stolen from this murdered woman and buried in the basement. But they obviously did not find the gold, which ultimately led to Hannah going down and passing out, and then Harriet also passing out. Hannah and Harriet would wake up after passing out. And when they woke up, they would tell these terrifying stories about what they saw. Hannah said she went down the stairs, she went over to the window where all the crowd was looking in, and she managed to get this curtain up, and then she yelled upstairs to her husband and her friends that she was coming back up. But when Hannah actually turned around to go to the stairs, she realized the ghost was in the basement with her. There was this old woman wearing a white gown standing between Hannah and the stairs. She was blocking her way. And this woman was staring at Hannah really intently. And then Hannah screamed, and this ghost charged at Hannah and basically went through her body. And it was at that point that Hannah passed out onto the ground. As for Harriet, when she came to, her story was even more terrifying. Harriet said after she placed that wet towel on Hannah's head, she looked up and she saw the woman in white walking up the stairs, staring directly at Harriet. And Harriet, she froze and kind of leaned back and just stared at this woman. And the woman, she came right to the top of the stairs. She stopped in the doorway, and then she opened up her mouth grotesquely wide and just continued to stare directly at Harriet. And then with slow, trembling hands, the woman began taking off her nightgown, which eventually fell to the ground. And Harriet saw this woman was covered in cuts and gashes all over her chest and neck. And then Harriet let out a scream, and she passed out too. Not long after Hannah and Harriet both came to and told their horrible stories, the police arrived outside and dispersed the big crowd, which meant Hannah and her husband could finally leave and go back to their own apartment, and they would. But just 12 hours later, Hannah would die. The Sheffield coroner held an inquest into Hannah's death, but he could find no scientific explanation for why Hannah actually died. And so on her death certificate, it basically says she died of fright. She was literally scared to death. Following Hannah's very bizarre and basically unexplained death, Harriet, who would survive, and the Favell family, they just moved out. They could not stand to be at that apartment any longer. And then also many more people who lived inside of this tenement apartment building on Campbell Lane, they also moved out because, again, it was just too terrifying to be near this basement. To this day, we still don't have a better explanation for what happened to Hannah. She was in good health, all things considered, when she died. And so really this didn't make any sense. And so this case still is one of the only in recorded history where somebody apparently died just from getting scared. In December of 2014, a 24-year-old man named Aaron Frazier sat in the driver's seat of an excavator in the backyard of his childhood home in Jacksonville, Florida. He pushed a lever forward, and he watched as the metal bucket dipped down and cut into this big slab of concrete, and debris went flying everywhere, and Aaron loved it. He smiled with satisfaction watching this destruction taking place, and he pressed the lever again and ripped off another piece of concrete. Today, Aaron was ripping out the backyard swimming pool of his old home, a home which his father had recently given him the deed to. But this property was not a nostalgic place for Aaron. In fact, he hadn't lived here since he was 3 years old, and the handful of memories he had from being in this place were basically all bad. His parents fought all the time, and then one day in 1993, his mom just decided to leave, and then after she was gone, his dad wasn't able to care for him, and so before long, Aaron was shipped off to foster care. So now he was kind of enjoying demolishing the property. He had some big renovations planned, starting with the backyard. By early afternoon, the pool was all gone. And so Aaron swung his bucket over to the outdoor shower that was located next to where the pool had been, and he dug the bucket into the concrete, and as soon as he did, immediately this geyser of water shot into the sky. And so Aaron knew he must have hit a water line. And so Aaron jumped out of the excavator, he turned off the water, and then he grabbed a shovel and headed over to the outdoor shower to inspect the damage. He basically needed to dig where the excavator bucket had just begun digging to see what exactly had been struck. And so with the shovel, he starts kind of moving away the mud and concrete, and at some point, the head of his shovel, the blade, it hits something sort of rigid and plastic. And he moved the shovel out of the way and he looked, and at first it looked like a plastic bag, but it was too rigid to be a plastic bag. And so he took a shovel and kind of moved the dirt out of the way, and he saw it was definitely not a plastic bag. It was thick plastic sheeting like you would use in major construction projects. Curious why the sheeting would be underneath this outdoor shower, Aaron used a shovel and basically pierced the plastic sheeting, and then he got down and peeled away the plastic with his bare hands. And as he did that, he began to notice that the sheeting was wrapped tightly around some sort of bulky object. And so he's pulling it away, and finally he reveals the object, and it's this old coconut. And so he actually reached down and pulled the coconut out and just stared at it, like, why is this under here? Aaron was really confused by this. Like, why would somebody take the time to wrap a coconut in waterproof industrial sheeting and then bury it? And so as Aaron just sort of stood there wondering what this could be, he began rotating this coconut around in his hands. And when he saw the back of this coconut, he screamed. It would turn out Aaron's mother did not just suddenly abandon the family. On the night of January 6th, 1993, the day that she vanished, well, Aaron's mom and father got into this huge fight. It got out of hand, and Aaron's father shot and killed Aaron's mother with a .22 caliber rifle. Aaron's father then staged the murder to look like Aaron's mother simply stormed out and never looked back. Now, when the police investigated her absence, they did not believe Aaron's father's story. They thought there was something off about it, but there wasn't enough hard evidence to actually connect him to the crime, and so nobody ever caught him. But that all changed in 2014 when a court ordered that the deed of Aaron's childhood home be transferred from his father to him. The coconut that Aaron found in the backyard of his home was his mother's skull. He just didn't realize it until he rotated it and saw her eye sockets. 5 years later, in 2019, Aaron's father was convicted of second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Around lunchtime on August 25th, 2012, a young woman named Grace was standing in a public restroom in front of the mirror in southern Iceland, applying makeup. Someone knocked on the door, and Grace quickly shouted an apology, but then made no move to finish up. Grace was in the middle of a solo bus trip across Iceland, and she was feeling kind of gross from all the travel. Every day around noon, the tour bus she was on would make a pit stop for lunch at whatever touristy location was nearby. And today, they were at Eldkau, which is the largest volcanic canyon in the world. Now, usually, Grace would use these pit stops not just to get lunch, but also to walk around and see the sights. but today she was using this break just to freshen up. So Grace finished putting on her eyeliner and put her hair up in a high ponytail, and then she changed her shirt, stuffing her old one back into her backpack. Then she stepped out of the bathroom into a large parking lot, and she saw her tour bus on the other side, and she saw other tour members making their way on board. Grace hustled across the lot, got onto the bus, and settled back into her seat. Only a few minutes later, the driver stood up and announced to the bus that it was time to leave. But before they left, he did what he did at every single stop. He did a head count, just to make sure nobody got left behind. Now, typically, Grace did not pay much attention to the driver when he did this head count. It was a very administrative thing. She would just sit there looking out the window waiting for the bus to start. But on this day, at some point, as Grace was sitting there, she realized the head count was taking a really long time. And when she noticed that, she looked up at the driver, and he looked visibly upset. And he was clearly doing the head count over and over again, like he was really trying to make sure he was doing it right. And then finally, the driver just announced to Grace and all the other people on the bus that they couldn't go anywhere because somebody from their tour group was missing. Now, the first thing they did is they just sat there and waited for about an hour, just hoping that this missing person would turn up. But when they didn't, the driver called the police. So this area, Eldkau, is a sprawling canyon that was formed more than 1,000 years earlier during a volcanic eruption. The canyon itself is very deep, and it has steep walls on either side, and at the bottom is all this volcanic debris. So it's beautiful to look at, but it's pretty difficult to navigate. And so if somebody was exploring this area on their own and somehow got lost in the process, this could become a very dangerous place for them very quickly. So when the bus driver called the police to report a missing tour group member in this particular area, the police immediately sent out a search and rescue party. And when they arrived, the first thing they did was interview the remaining tour group members to try to figure out who the missing person actually was, because it wasn't clear yet. Pretty quickly, some of the tour group members recalled seeing this young woman of Asian descent who was wearing dark clothes and was carrying a light-colored bag, who had left the bus at the beginning of lunch and had not returned. Now, Grace had not personally seen this young woman, and she told police as much when she was interviewed. But she, like basically everybody else on the tour, immediately volunteered to help with the search. So, for the entire rest of the day, that is what Grace and the others all did. They searched for this missing person. Grace was teamed up with another member of the tour, as well as a trained rescuer, and they walked out into the canyon, searching along a grid pattern with the rest of the team. After a few hours with no luck, officials sent in more rescuers and a helicopter. And by the time the night fell, the entire canyon was lit up by searchlights, and you could barely hear anything over the sound of the helicopter making repeated passes overhead. But despite this enormous effort, there still was no sign of the missing tourist. Finally, at around 3 a.m., Grace broke off from the search and returned to the bus to get some sleep. But before settling into her seat, Grace opened up her backpack to pull out some makeup wipes, and as she did that, something inside of her bag caught her eye. And when she saw it, she froze. She stared at this object, and as she did, she felt herself break out in a cold sweat, because suddenly she knew exactly where this missing woman was. It would turn out that over the course of the previous day, the people on board the bus made a series of small mistakes, but together they snowballed and turned into one huge mistake. First, the bus driver had made a mistake with his head count. Not the head count he had done that afternoon, but the one he had done earlier that day, before they drove to Eldkau. That morning, he had accidentally counted one too many people on board the bus and not realized it. Then, that afternoon, when he had counted again and actually had the right number of people on board, he thought there was a missing person. Next, the description of the woman who had gotten off the bus and didn't come back, the so-called missing person, that description had only been half correct. So yes, there had been a young woman of Asian descent wearing a dark sweatshirt, carrying a light-colored bag. She had gotten off the bus, but she did get back on. Except that when she did, she looked different, and so nobody recognized her. And this was because this woman had gotten off the bus to go to the restroom to freshen up. She had put on makeup, she had put her hair up in a ponytail, and she had taken off her dark-colored sweatshirt. The object that Grace found in her backpack that made her realize that she knew exactly where this missing woman was her dark-colored sweatshirt inside of her light-colored backpack. And it was at that exact moment that Grace knew. The person that she had spent the last 15 hours searching for was herself. Before dawn on December 12, 1992, a 17-year-old girl named Tracy Dion sat in the passenger seat of a little two-door car that was swerving down a deserted road in the Yankton Sioux Reservation in South Dakota. Everybody in the car was drunk, including Tracy. Sitting next to Tracy in the middle front seat was her 19-year-old cousin named Ruby, and Ruby's boyfriend, a 20-year-old named Arnold, was driving the car. All three of them had been out partying all night, and so now they were trying to make it home. The swerving was making Tracy feel sick to her stomach, but she didn't want to say anything to Arnold in fear that she might distract him. I mean, it was really dark outside, there was no streetlights, there was ice on the road. I mean, for a sober driver, this would be a challenging drive, let alone a drunk driver. They were coming up on an intersection, and Arnold brought the car to a stop with a lurch. Tracy watched as Arnold checked for cross traffic and then pulled out onto Highway 281. But halfway through this turn, as Arnold was accelerating, Tracy began to feel the car slide, and even in her drunken state, she could tell Arnold had hit a patch of black ice. And so as the car began to skid, she wanted to scream, but before she could, the car was already flipping over, and then everything went black. A short time later, Tracy came to. The car was upside down, and Tracy quickly realized she had fallen out of her seat and was now basically resting on the roof of the car, which was now on the ground. From what she could tell, after the car had finished rolling over, it had come to a stop just off the side of the highway, and so they were not in immediate danger from other cars striking them. But she couldn't really see outside because the windows were so badly cracked. Beside her, Tracy could hear her cousin, Ruby, pounding on the driver's side door trying to get it to open, and so Tracy tried to look around Ruby to see Arnold, to see if he was okay, but when she did, she saw the driver's seat was empty. Tracy tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The driver's side door was closed, but Arnold was gone. Just then, Tracy heard the sound of the driver's side door opening, and she turned to see her cousin Ruby forcing the door open just a few inches, and then a second later, Ruby was slithering out through that crack to the outside. To Tracy, everything felt like it was happening in slow motion. She was too shocked and confused to make any sense of it. But if Ruby was getting out of the car, Tracy felt like she should too. And so Tracy turned and crawled across to the driver's side and was about to make an exit the same way Ruby had when the door slammed shut violently right in Tracy's face. Tracy didn't understand why Ruby would do something like that. Why would she shut the door that aggressively when she knew her cousin was still inside? Tracy tried to open the door again, but she was too weak to do it. She figured her cousin Ruby was okay, but she couldn't see outside because of how cracked the windows were. At this point, Tracy began to feel woozy. She laid her head down on the roof of the car, wondering to herself why Ruby and Arnold had left her behind. Tracy would stay trapped inside of the car, alone, for a few hours, until finally a motorist saw the flipped-over car and called 911. Shortly after that, first responders arrived on the scene, they pulled Tracy out of the car, and shockingly, she actually didn't have really any serious injuries at all. She didn't even need to be hospitalized. But rescuers could not find Ruby or Arnold anywhere. They were gone. And once rescuers had scoured the entire area around the crash site, the sheriff who was in charge of the scene started to wonder if Arnold and Ruby were not just missing. Maybe, he thought, they had fled. Arnold had been driving drunk, and all three of them were underage, and so the sheriff thought maybe Arnold and Ruby were scared to get in trouble. Over the next few days, the police continued to search the surrounding area for Arnold and Ruby, hoping they were not badly injured and that they would just turn up on their own, but they never did. And as the days turned into weeks, hope began to wane for the young couple. Their family and friends kept searching the area along 281 where the car had flipped, looking for any clue as to where these two had gone. But there was nothing. There was no trace of them. It was like Arnold and Ruby had gotten out of the car and just vanished. But in January of 1993, so 3 weeks after the crash, strange and conflicting reports of sightings began to trickle in. First, a woman came forward claiming to have seen Arnold, alive and well, at a New Year's Eve party. Now, the police doubted this claim, but this woman was insistent that she had seen Arnold, and they actually hooked her up to a lie detector test, and she passed the test. And so officials brought in guests from this party who this woman claimed were with Arnold, and they asked them, "Were you with Arnold?" And they said no, but they failed their lie detector tests. Now, of course, this was suspicious, but police really didn't know what to do with this information. Assuming this woman's story was true, that she really did see Arnold, well, according to the details of her story,
Arnold did not appear to be in any kind of distress. And even if he was in distress, the police still had no idea where he was, so how could they help him? Other locals came forward, claiming to have spotted Arnold around town as well. But nothing came of those reports either. Neither Arnold nor Ruby turned up. Months went by, and the case went cold. Until March 10th, when a driver was going down Highway 281 and they noticed a strange object in the drainage ditch next to the road. By now, the weather was much warmer than it had been on the day of the crash. So instead of snow and ice inside of this drainage ditch, it was runoff water, and the strange object was floating in it. The driver stopped his car, got out, and walked up to see what this thing was, and as soon as he saw it, he turned, ran back to his car, and called the police. Because what the driver had just found was a dead body. And when the police arrived and searched the area, they found another body not far away. The bodies belonged to Ruby and Arnold. But this discovery did not solve the mystery of what happened to Ruby and Arnold. Instead, it made it much more bizarre. Because first of all, the bodies were found 75 feet away from the original crash site. And the exact spots where the two bodies were found had been searched many, many times on the day of the crash, days after the crash. They were searched by police. They were searched by friends and family of Ruby and Arnold. The idea that this is where the bodies had been the whole time was impossible. They would have been found. And then there was the condition of the bodies. Ruby's body was extremely decomposed, which made sense given the fact that the crash was 3 months earlier. But Arnold's body was barely decomposed at all. And in the pocket of Arnold's jeans, police found a mysterious set of 3 keys. 1 was a vehicle key and 2 were house keys. But none of them opened any vehicle or building that Arnold was known to frequent, and nobody recognized them. Finally, the police found a tuft of hair lying near where the bodies had been found. It was Ruby's hair, but it didn't look like the hair had been there for very long, certainly not 3 months. Instead of being dirty and matted, like you would expect given how long she must have been there, the hair was perfectly clean. The official coroner's report on Ruby and Arnold's deaths were that they died of exposure, and then their bodies were just overlooked by searchers for months. But to a lot of people, including the sheriff who was in charge of the original crash site, this made no sense. Despite the coroner's findings, law enforcement officials believed that Ruby and Arnold's deaths were the result of foul play. Under the foul play theory, somebody pulled Ruby and Arnold out of the crash site while they were still alive and then killed them later. And then perhaps they killed them at different times, which would account for the differences in decomposition of their bodies. The FBI ultimately came in and took over this case, but they eventually closed it down, citing a lack of evidence to support the foul play theory. However, with or without foul play being involved here, nobody has a good explanation for all those sightings of Arnold after the crash. And also, nobody can explain why the door was slammed in Tracy's face in the immediate aftermath of the crash. Maybe it was Ruby or Arnold who slammed the door, or maybe it was their killer. To this day, what actually happened on December 12, 1992, on the side of Highway 281, remains a mystery.
The same. I used to wait for someone's call. Now I don't wait at all. I thought I needed someone's light to make it through the quiet nights, but silence taught me how to see there was more inside of me. Not lost, not fixed, just something in between. I'm still me, even alone, even when the lights are gone, even when the lights are gone, even when no one stays around, I still hear my own sound. I'm still me, no matter what, even when it's hard enough to stand inside.
The gears keep turning, they never sleep. In the silence, their whispers creep. Tick-tock, tick-tock, they count my grief. I built a heart from rust and time, a hollow friend with no reply. Taking gears, they sigh, lonely hands reaching sky.
And now, here is a clip from the latest episode of Redacted. Enjoy.
Her heart skipped a beat. She knew that he meant the CIA agents, which meant he knew what she'd been up to and why she was here now. Marita struggled to find words as tears filled her eyes. And to her horror, Fidel drew his gun out of his holster. But he didn't point it at her like she'd expected. Instead,